Welcome to the Conscious Diva podcast. I'm Tatiana, and joining me in this episode is my friend and breathwork guide and meditation teacher, Matteo Pistono. Matteo is the author of several books on the subject of meditation and spirituality. In this latest book, Breathe How You Want to Feel, Matteo shares how this is a breathing toolkit for better health, restorative sleep, and a deeper connection with ourselves and everyone in our lives. This is a fantastic how-to book for upgrading your nervous system to learn to live your optimal life physically, emotionally, and spiritually. In this episode, we discuss why we aren't taught how to breathe, mouth breathing versus nose breathing, how to become a conscious breather, and how thinking about our mortality allows us to live fully and die without regrets. We also discuss various breathing and pranayama practices, as well as the Whim Hoff method and holotropic breathing. I love this book and chatting with Matteo about how we can all learn actionable breathing tools to improve our health and well-being for better breathing and sleep. I hope you enjoy this episode, and don't forget to write a review and follow me on Instagram at The Conscious Diva. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks, Matteo. Thank you so much for being here today. It's awesome. I love your new book,
Oh,
Breathe
look
How
at
You
that.
Want to Feel.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Thank you.
You're welcome. And when I got the book, immediately, like literally the first page, I was drawn in because that story of when you're a boy and that experience, I'm not going to give away, the whole book because you want people to go
Yeah.
read it. But I was totally like, whoa, okay, that for me, that made a lot of sense for what you do now with your spiritual
Mm.
and teaching breathing. So I thought that was really wild. So, okay, let me come back to my questions here. I have literally, as you can see, all of my colored
Yeah,
post.
I love that. I love that. I'd be interested to see what you, as like a pranayama practitioner as well, and as somebody who's a meditator and somebody who is a voyager of the internal landscape. So I'm really interested to see what lands, what strikes, because you, as an author, you never are exactly certain what's going to. I think I've been surprised this last week with the response, as you said, to the first story, which we won't like, but the first story is like where I'm a young boy and this tree falls on me and I'm no longer for a little while, right? The near
Yeah.
death experience. But the last part of the book, which I'm sure we'll talk
Hmm.
about both breathing and dying. So many people are reaching out about that part. So
Oh,
that's
no, we will
interesting.
definitely get to that part. But, just to
Yeah.
quickly answer your question, because I made notes based on two things. First, my personal experience, but also understanding that the audience, it may be their first experience with understanding some of the techniques, the terminology, particularly not knowing that you could be a mouth breather or a nose breather.
Hmm.
Also, as I was reading it, there were so many things about my husband's, the way he breathes, right? And I was like, oh my God, that's you, that's you, that's you, that's you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, on the weekend, I was messaging you. Mouth tape. I didn't have the book with me, and I wasn't holding it. It wasn't in the car. And then he said, "Oh, let's go to the chemist and get some mouth tape." And so that's how we found ourselves at the chemist looking for mouth tape. We did get the right one, so
Yeah.
it's fine. And he has been using it. And I'm going to share those experiences, or give you the feedback in a sec. But let's just start with like the
Okay.
first question that came to mind was, why aren't we taught how to breathe? Because we're all born breathing, right? It's part, like, we don't breathe when we're not in our bodies.
I mean, it's a really good question because it isn't as though just the most recent scientific data on the importance of breath and how we breathe affects our nervous system and how our nervous system affects our breath and
Mhm.
how that is the very foundation for how we feel. Like it's the foundation. So and it's not, like I said, it's not as though the surge of scientific research in the last decade, especially on respiratory science and how this affects our nervous system, wasn't known before, right? It isn't as though the pranayama yogis from the Indian subcontinent, a couple thousand years ago, didn't know this. So the question is like, why aren't we taught this? Like, why aren't we taught this in school,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
for sure.
Why aren't children and because it doesn't have to be, it can be in manageable, um, it sort of manageable practices. Just with, for example, I could imagine talking to my young niece. Well, I did actually when she was younger. I would say, when you get upset, if what happens if you just like extend your exhale and blow your exhale out? I know I'm telling them to mouth breathe, but it's a child, right? So it's okay. I wish I would have been told this when I was like 11, right? When I was being bullied, when I was being like on the playground, when I was upset playing baseball, just very simple things where it is then it's a key that people can use to be like, oh, this actually has an effect on how I feel, right? So the question then you ask, why aren't we taught this? Actually, I don't know. In 1899, there was a study in England. This title of the study was "Shut Your Mouth and Save Your Brain."
Hmm.
So they knew at that time that mouth breathing had detrimental effects on cognition, right? So I mean, why it isn't? Maybe it's because the breath is so automatic, right? I mean, we do this. We breathe between 20 and 30,000 times a day, and if we don't pay attention to it, it's still going to happen until it doesn't. And at
Yeah.
that point, once we move beyond the breath, we have other considerations to tend to.
You would think that PE in schools would be a great opportunity before kids start engaging in sports when they're
Right.
in the lowest classes. Would be a great opportunity to actually educate people on how to, because they're about to play a sport, and you talk about this as well in your book too.
Or how about right before? I taught a number of kids this, high school kids, of what to do before you take an exam.
Yeah.
Like literally just the 1 minute before you start taking your exam, what can you do to put your mind, your cognitive ability, and how you feel in the most optimal space so you can take that test well, right? And as I say in Breathe How You Want to Feel, these things aren't super complicated. We do just have to understand a little bit of, we just have to do it a few times beforehand. For example, right before our podcast here, it's morning time here. And I like looked within for a moment. I'm like, how am I feeling? And I was like, actually, I'm a little bit nervous, but I don't want to come, but it's morning time. So if I do some like super down regulating practice, I'll like maybe get a bit lethargic. So what did I do? I just observed, and then I did like a 2 breath intervention. I sat down and I did a 2 breath intervention to have this sort of spacious feeling, but still focused, not too lethargic, not
Mhm.
too amped up, right? And I can do this here. A school can do it. Anybody can do it at any point. So I don't know why we don't teach this in schools.
It's so sad. It's like such a waste opportunity for people to learn about themselves, and also an opportunity for not only learning about ourselves, but how to self-regulate. And as you just mentioned, with different scenarios, whether it's bullying or stress or exams or playing sport, when we have an opportunity to understand our breath and how it affects us, we can manage our lives in such an uplifting way, like a really positive way. Right? We don't
Absolutely.
have arguments, or if we're about to feel that, you can actually tune in and, I don't want to say stop yourself, but you can approach the scenario from a place of mindfulness and awareness, is probably a better word, where you're not, your body's therefore not getting in this state of, fight or flight, or, anxiety, or all these other things. So let's just go into like how this book is so empowering, because it really, you break down breathing both incorrectly and correctly, and how this affects our overall well-being.
Right.
And really, you name it as the mechanics of breathing. That there's plenty of breathing experts out there who teach great techniques, but as you say in your book, no one's really breaking down the mechanics. They're just kind of giving you some practices and some tools, saying, hey, go to this great breathing app that I use, or whatever. So
Right.
what are the mechanics of breathing, like, and why is it important to understand this?
Yeah, the reason it's important is so as you said, there's many different techniques, and I cover a lot of them. I discuss a lot of them in the book, and the likely effects, but not always, because we all have different physiology, right? If we're all different, then when we apply the medicine of breathing, then we're going to react differently. So the dose matters, right? The dose, just like in medicine, the way that we breathe matters. And so the way that I approach this is that I don't give a singular breathing technique. And let me give you one story on why it just exemplifies, I think, why we don't want to have to do the singular technique just by rote. So right before the pandemic, I was in the morning time for about a year. I'd been doing this very upregulating breathing practice, right? So what it looked like was I would get up, pull a shot of espresso, get down on my yoga mat, and I would start doing this like very energetic breathing, right? And for about 7 months, it was amazing, right? I did this practice. I would upregulate and I'd be holding my breath. I would be doing these various things. And afterwards, I would have this laser focus. I would jump up and go in my cold plunge and then come to work and just be all very productive. And then the pandemic rolled around and I just continued to do the practice. I didn't check in at the beginning of how I felt. So I would do the same thing. And at the end of the breathing practice, I would be so tense. I would just, and I didn't really recognize it for a couple weeks actually. I would just be so tense. I would come into work. I wasn't protective. I've had a kind of a brain fog because I just wanted to get away from everything. And what I was doing was I was just doing a singular technique without taking into consideration my baseline, how I was feeling at the beginning of it. So my approach to this is have that if you want to have your upregulating, that is energy giving breathing practices, know that you have that availability and know that you have down regulating practices as well, or practices that put you into sort of a flow state or anything in between. And once we understand how to do those various things, not because your guru told you that this is how it happens,
Yeah.
but because you know that when you exhale longer than you inhale, it's relaxing. When you know that you hold your inhale at the top of your inhale, it gives you energy. Or if you hold your breath at the bottom of your exhale, it down regulates. These
Mhm.
various things, and it's physiology. Again, there's some change with different people depending upon their sort of their state of being. But generally speaking, we're talking about human physiology here. So my approach to it is to understand and I give these sort of 5 tools right at the beginning of the book that you can use with any breathing practice, whether you practice Wim Hof or Kundalini or Soma or whatever sort of technique you want. I break it down in terms of if what it looks like physiologically. And so I give these 5 at the beginning, I give these 5 tools. And then in the second part of the book, we apply those 5 tools to how we should be breathing in day to day. We should be breathing when we're on Zoom calls or on podcasts, how we should be breathing, or not should, but what is the optimal way to breathe if we want to breathe how we want to feel, if we want to breathe how we want to live. And so I sort of break this down.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And it really made me think a lot about my own breathing. And as you said in the beginning, I already have an established practice for decades, and I was really pleasantly. I don't want to say surprised is not quite the right word, but I was pleasantly pleased with myself that as I was reading, particularly when you was describing where the tongue should be placed on the upper palate and the way it's spread out, I was aware of that as I was reading that. I was like, oh, I'm doing that. I didn't even realize. I was like, oh, yes, I'm
Right.
doing that. Okay, cool. And my lips were closed and stuff. And so there were things that I was like, oh, and then as I was going through your book, it really made me think about, well, over the decades of practicing pranayama and how it's affected my health and also the physiological changes that I've experienced. So, for example, when I was younger, I grew up in Australia. We would have these crazy oak trees there with these fluffy pom-pom like pods, and in the spring they just shed like nothing else. It looks like everything, particularly in Sydney along the coast where I grew up in the eastern
Mm,
suburbs, there were these fluffy things for a series of weeks everywhere. Oh my gosh, I would just sneeze my brains out. I was the
yeah.
worst. I'd have like the worst. And I think probably when I was younger, I may have partial. I think most of us when we're younger are mouth breathers or partial mouth breathers. I'm going to ask you about that in a minute. But what I realized, because I used to go up show jumping horses And when you're in an arena, you naturally, by default, are inhaling tons of dust. And
Mm-hmm.
at school, in biology, I remember being taught about the cilia in our noses, in our nasal passages, I should say.
Yeah.
And I was very aware of that because after writing, I would blow my nose, and sorry to be gross, but there'd a whole bunch of,
No,
black and
of
brown dot, like
course.
the stuff would come out. And I would
Yeah.
think to myself, oh my gosh, thank God, thank goodness I have all these hairs in my nose that are filtering
Yeah.
out the dust and the yucky stuff. Because oh my God, and I was so aware of not like writing and being, or whatever, if we're mucking out the stalls or whatever we were doing, inhaling stuff, because I just thought, God, like all that stuff
Right.
straight into my lungs. But anyway, I'm totally like digressing to my personal stuff, but it made me really think a lot about these factors. And now, as you know, I'm almost 50, my breathing, I don't get affected with allergies as significantly as I did when I was younger. In fact, every year, the last several years, I'd say last 5 or 6 years, I've barely had any allergies. And I really, your book really made me think about the way I've been breathing and how because of the amount of oxygen that's going through my body, because of how I'm affecting everything. So can you explain what's the difference between nasal breathing and mouth breathing, and how these things, what are the effects of those? I don't want to say it's all negative or it's all positive, but what are the effects of let's start with being a mouth breather.
Yeah. I mean, let's just start with the understanding that we have the option to breathe through our nose. We have the option to breathe through our mouth. And when we breathe, we inhale, there's a slight pause, we exhale, slight pause, and we breathe in again, right? So we can breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth, or in through the mouth and out through the mouth, or any combination there between. You can even breathe in the nose and mouth at the same time. I don't talk about this actually in the book. In the nose and mouth at the same time, and out the mouth and nose at the same time. This sort of a pranayama technique as well. But there's effects when we breathe through the nose and we breathe through the mouth. There are effects on our physiology when we do that, right? In the book, the mantra of the book, as you may have read, the mantra of the book is keep it nasal,
Hmm.
right? So I'll just cut to the chase that in everything that we do, unless we're exercising intensely, swimming, speaking, or eating, we should be breathing through our nose, right? And it's not as though you're going to if you breathe through your mouth, like you're going to sort of like drop over tomorrow. But especially long term, the chronic mouth breathers, there's serious mental and physical health risks to breathing through your mouth all the time. We call it chronic mouth breathing, or as I use this term in the book, over breathing. And we'll talk a little bit about what is over breathing. And so I'm advocating in the book to be breathing through your nose because of the multitude of benefits. And we can go into the benefits. I mean, basically, the physical benefits of breathing through your nose, you touched on it already. When we breathe through the nose, the nasal passageway, the sinuses, it looks like a maze, almost like a conch shell. There's alleyways, and there's little nooks and crannies, and it's all lined with, as you said, the cilia, right? These little hairs. And in those hairs, the base of them, there's a sort of a mucous membrane. And so as the air moves in, as we breathe in through the nose, the air circulates and before it arrives in our lungs. And as it's moving, the air is warmed, it's humidified, and it's purified, it's cleaned. And this cleaning is one of the things that you were talking about, that it literally collects and traps pathogens, large and small, as you breathe in. But it also purifies because in that cilia, in this mucous membrane, there is there's a molecule called nitric oxide, not nitrous oxide, which you may have but you breathed in it, maybe it's sort of speak funny, but nitric oxide, right? And this nitric oxide is a vasodilator, it's a bronchodilator, and it helps clean the air, right? So if you can imagine that if we're breathing in pathogens, or if it's dust, or if it's dirt, or whatever the case may be, if we breathe in through the mouth, there is none of this cleansing that happens. It goes right in the mouth. It goes over the sort of tonsil area, the back of the throat, and right down into the lungs. And the lungs are very vulnerable. They don't have the sort of quality to be able to purify in the way that the nasal passageway does. So when we breathe in through the nose, it cleans, purifies, and humidifies the air, right? So that is one thing I talk about in the book. The other thing that happens when we breathe through the nose, if you just sort of when you breathe in through the nose, you can feel that there's more constriction, that there's more force that's needed to breathe in, and that's just simply a matter that the holes of your nose are smaller than the big hole of your mouth. So you need a little bit more force, like a syringe, point a
We call that the
syringe.
mouth a pie hole in Australia.
The pie hole, exactly. That's good. That's good. So when we breathe in through the nose, you feel this. It's almost like pulling a syringe, like a suction, and that suction is happening from your diaphragm. And so we hear oftentimes people say, "Oh, belly." Your doctor may have told you to belly breathe to relax, or there's a lot of benefits to be breathing low down rather than high up in our chest. And when we breathe through the nose, it encourages diaphragmatic breathing or belly breathing, as opposed to when we breathe through the mouth, we tend to breathe in the upper chest. And what this ends up doing is it uses these secondary breathing muscles in our shoulders and our neck, and this immediately begins to have tension in the upper back. It causes neck and back pain, shoulder pain, and it decreases the stability of our core because we're not using our diaphragm. And this in turn, it is the reason that a lot of times we have back and lower hip pain because we have this destabilized core. When people come to me and I'm teaching them breathing and whatnot, if they tell me that they have lower back pain, I almost immediately know that they're mouth breathers,
Wow.
because this mouth breathing encourages a poor posture and a very loose core, right? And so it immediately your lower back. I mean, there's other reasons. It's not as though that breathing is the only reason for this,
No,
but
it's fascinating. I mean, so when I was reading your book, and they said before, I was telling my husband, "Oh my gosh, that's you," because he does experience a lot of the side effects, if you will, of being a mouth breather. Things like he's in the process with a doctor right now of investigating whether he's got sleep apnea, because he does tend
yeah,
to.
let's talk about that. Yeah.
So he totally tends to do these, which, oh my God, we call it puffing. He literally falls
Yeah.
asleep, whether he's on the couch or in the bed laying next to me. He literally, before he's about to drift into a deep state of sleep, he does like 2 to 3 minutes of, and I'm like, oh
Yeah.
my God, what's like, it's like
But you know what
a
happens, Tatiana,
ball of wind that gets shot
yeah,
at me.
yeah, there's this puffing, there's sort of, so, and he doesn't drop into deep sleep.
He
He
doesn't. He
wakes
doesn't
himself
then.
up.
Correct. And then also sometimes in the middle of the night, he wakes up, and which is also written in your book, where he can't breathe. He will wake up and he literally freaks out. He's like, "Oh, I stopped breathing," and he has
Yeah.
this panic attack for 5 minutes or so. And so anyway, I pointed out all these things. I said, "Oh my gosh, he's going to read your book." Like
Yeah. I
and
mean,
say,
let's talk about that for a moment, because Tatiana, because so many people ask about sleep. So people say, like, what does the breathing have to do with sleep? And it's like, it
yeah,
is so critically important, especially people with obstructive sleep apnea, or if they snore. If you're snoring, then you're mouth breathing
yeah,
when
he
you sleep.
sometimes snores too.
So what happens when we're so let me just say this. First of all, the most important training that we can do, the way that you're going to breathe during sleep is governed by the way that you breathe during the day.
Mhm.
Because breathing, the way what our mouth does, what our tongue does, if we can breathe in and out of the nose, these things are habitual, right? We create these habits of breathing. So if we are over breathing, if we're panting with our mouth open, if we're scrolling with our mouth open, if every time we carry groceries in from the store or walk to the car, the mouth is open and we're panting, then almost certainly you're going to mouth breathe during the night. And when you mouth breathe during the night, you have a lot of disrupted sleep, right? So you're continuing. What ends up happening is the mouth is open. Like some of our listeners, you might even like if you when I ask people when I begin asking people about their how they sleep, I said, "Do you have chapped lips?" They're like, "Oh yeah, of course I got some." So you have cotton mouth in the morning. Oh yeah, oh yeah. So do you wake up 3 or 4 times during the night to go pee? Yeah, yeah, yeah. So these are all indications of mouth breathing. And I
Mm.
immediately know that they're mouth breathers. Why? If you have your mouth open and you're breathing in and out of your mouth during the night, you're blowing air essentially over your lips and your mouth, and so you're just drying everything out. The crazy thing. Oh, go ahead.
Well, what's interesting about that is, so my husband doesn't get up to urinate during the night. He does like to
Hmm.
keep a glass of water next to the bed, and I feel like he sleeps less hours. He gets up really early every morning, and he'll meditate every morning, but he's doesn't feel rested. So I just wanted to add that in because he doesn't get up and pee. I don't think
Yeah, yeah.
everyone necessarily does.
You're right. So, and this is a really interesting sort of comment you make that they don't feel rested. So people sleep, so they may have been in bed 7, 8, or even 9 hours, but their sleep cycle is disrupted because of their waking themselves up because of the mouth breathing, because they're either gasping or they're having this obstructive sleep apnea. And what ends up happening is apnea is a Greek word, means to stop, right? So we're stopping. The means to stop, and pneum means to breathe. So you're stop breathing, and that is caused from a number of different reasons, but one of them is when you have your mouth open, the tongue naturally falls to the base of your mouth. And when you're sleeping on your back, especially, the tongue will move to the back of the throat and it closes off the back of the throat and you stop breathing. So you're sleeping, you're not breathing, and that goes on for about 30 to 40 seconds and then gasp, right? There's this gasping and you wake up, but not everybody wakes up, like totally wakes up. There's these micro awakenings. And this is one of what happens during obstructive sleep apnea is that there's many, like 30 or 40 times an hour
Wow.
micro awakenings, right? So the sleep cycle is that you sort of go this light sleep, then you go into sort of REM sleep where you're dreaming,
Mhm.
and then you go into this deep sleep, non-dreaming deep sleep. And this deep sleep is so critically important for our cognitive health, for our memory consolidation. It's the thing that helps us not get Alzheimer's, right? This micro awakenings prevents us from from moving into REM and especially deep sleep. Because that deep sleep cycle needs to last about 45 minutes. There's 2 to 5 of them a night. And if we're continually waking up, whether it's just snoring, because the snoring can also wake us up or keep us from going into that deep sleep, or obstructive sleep apnea, it's critically important. And so then the question arises, like, how do you sleep with your mouth closed? And it sounds crazy, but we can tape our mouth closed. And people are like, that sounds crazy. Like I'm gonna like I'll suffocate, or I'll just feel so weird. I won't feel like I can breathe. And so I talk about in the book how you can approach it. And when I say tape your mouth shut, I'm not talking about like duct tape and going from edge to edge. That's not what I'm describing at all. I recommend medical tape. It's this very porous tape that's very light that you can always just open your lips. It would come off because what you're doing is you're not necessarily sealing your mouth, you're training your lips and training your jaw and training your tongue to be in this optimal position for sleep. Because when the tongue is on the roof of the mouth, the lips are gently closed, then it opens up the esophagus and we breathe through the nose and we have all these benefits. And I only mentioned one of them with nitric oxide and then purifying and cleaning, but there's many more benefits of breathing through the nose when the mouth is sealed.
So it's interesting, my husband, he went and got the medical tape, and I also said, no, don't put a band-aid on your mouth, because that'll also rip off, that'll hurt too. He's got quite a large mouth and thicker lips, so he used quite a lot of, like, a lengthy piece of tape in the center of his lips, right under his
Yeah.
mouth. And he slept an hour later, normally wakes up at 6 every morning. He woke up at 7, and he said he actually felt more rested. Now, it was only the first day. He wasn't sure, was that really true? Last night, he put it on again. Interestingly, he puffed through the sides of his
Through the
mouth.
sides. Yeah.
And it was so crazy because this morning he woke up and he said, was I puffing last night? I feel like I was puffing through the. I said, yeah, you were. You totally were. And I said, well, Matteo also suggests in the book that you tape it with a cross across your meaning.
You can
try with the cross.
Exactly. There's different ways you can do it with the cross or just over the front, but there are these, but it is this training of the lips and of the mouth. And I know this personally, Tatiana, because with the tongue, as a child, I had a tongue thrust, a problem where my tongue would go to the bottom of my mouth and push forward and hit my bottom teeth. And so it would make the teeth like buck teeth, like have the teeth stick out. And
Yeah,
so
I
I
mean,
had to
I
go
had
to
braces for that. I wondered if I did the same thing when I read that in your book. I mean, I think that's probably very common, unless, like you say, you had a dentist who identified this, which was really lucky. So
yeah. And I had to do essentially calisthenics with my tongue. And I recommend even in the book, because a strong tongue is very important and it helps us spread the palate. And I wanted to mention this too, Tatiana. This whole thing with breathing through the nose and the tongue on the roof of the mouth, what this ends up doing is it allows us to breathe slower. And when we breathe slower, we make better decisions. Why? Because our nervous system is relaxed with a sort of panoramic view of what's happening, but with focus. And this comes about from nasal breathing. And you had mentioned that when you were riding your horses, I think you were show jumping. Is that what you were doing?
no.
Yeah. So when you're show jumping, so you were breathing through your nose, so you didn't take in like the dirt and whatnot from your mouth. But the other benefit of this is the increased cognitive decision making when you breathe through your nose. We make better decisions when we're nasal breathing. And so whenever I'm like mountain biking or snowboarding or skiing, when I'm needing to make very quick or even enter in that kind of flow state where you're not actually making the decision, but you're sort of naturally in that flow state, nasal breathing facilitates that. If someone's panting, there's no flow.
Yeah.
There's no great. It's just reactive.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. It's so important, and yeah, 100%. You can feel the difference. And interestingly, even on Saturday in the day, my husband really because I was reading this on Friday afternoon and telling him all this stuff. So then on Saturday, he was from the morning all day and yesterday so aware. He said, I totally am a mouth breather. I never even realized it. And all day he kept saying to me, wow, I'm really trying to put my tongue, to actually close my mouth and breathe through my nose. And then he said, I'm gonna have to stop talking.
It's true. It's actually true that when we speak, we oftentimes are mouth breathers when we speak, and that's sort of like that it doesn't have to be. We can breathe through our nose while we're speaking. It slows everything down. Like, and I sometimes I even mention that in the book, that if you're arguing with your partner or with your spouse, try nasal breathing. It slows the argument down
Oh,
real quick.
100%. Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, I've been practicing that for several years now, and whoa, like what a difference. It's amazing actually. When he's doing the speaking or the whatever arguing, I will then become aware of that. And actually the response, it's almost like I don't even care anymore. I don't even want to engage in the argument. It's
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
I'm just like, I'm in another headspace about it. So it's awesome. It's so important. But also on the point in what you were talking about in the book, being or setting, and two things: intention, which I love that you have in every single practice. You recommend an intention, and the other one is really thinking about your state of mind, or your state of being. How are you feeling in that moment before you breathe? So this morning, and what is it called? I can't remember, but I actually timed myself this morning because I was curious to see how long my out breath and my in breath hold would be. And the reason I did it today is because I'm menstruating and I wanted to see the difference because physiologically, as women, when we menstruate, all these breath practices affect us very differently from when we're not. So you
Absolutely.
wouldn't go use the same thing that you would when you're not, menstruating because and I could really feel the fire. Whoa. Like when I was after I started breathing again, and it was still a minute, over a minute of holding, but I was like, whoa, I could really feel the heat in my body. So immediately I knew this is not something I should do during this time because I
Yeah,
felt,
exactly.
not
Yeah,
a good
and that
feeling.
yeah, so you just said that. So this is so interesting. So you were talking about how you're feeling or how you might be feeling right now, sort of during your cycle, right?
Yeah.
But you also mentioned what your husband said, "Oh, just 2 days ago, we started sort of talking about mouth breathing, and I'm doing it all the time during the day, or I'm trying not to." This the connection between those two is the first thing I talk about in Breathe How You Want to Feel. And that is honing our awareness.
Hmm.
That that it all begins with this, and it's a particular kind of awareness. It's called interoception. This how we feel and the awareness of how we feel and how stimulation around us is affecting that and how we can intervene vis-a-vis the breath. This process of how we feel, what we do, our response back and forth is this thing that we call interoception. And that's where all of this starts. And that's why I feel it's very important that we start there rather than just by rote or by tradition or by whatever reason you just do a singular breathing practice all the time. It's not always going to work. And in fact, it can have a detrimental effect. Some breathing practices might very well make you stressed out.
Hmm.
Other breathing practices might make you fall asleep when you don't want to fall asleep, right?
Yeah.
So, and the thing that knows this is not your guru or your teacher, it's your interoceptive awareness. And when we have that, it is so empowering because between Viktor Frankl said this between stimulation and reaction, there's a gap. And in that gap is where we find our freedom, right? That guy wrote that in a Nazi concentration camp. He was sort of seeing that there was all of this stimulation around him, horrific, and the stimulation that was coming from within him, his thoughts and emotions, and that there could be a gap if he didn't immediately react, just this habitual reaction. And this interoceptive awareness is what recognizes the stimulation and allows for us to intervene in the gap, to take our power back from what the news, what politics, what social media, what all of this stimulation around us. And I'm not saying that we want to become sort of immune to feeling, quite the contrary. Feel it, but then have some agency in how you come back towards it, how you react. And my book is about agency. It's about giving us agency in our life.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
So that's the connection that I make between those two things. Mm.
and you also have it as an acronym AIR. So just
Exactly.
quickly come back to explaining what AIR stands for.
Yeah, it's just the acronym AIR with all of this starts with awareness. And as you said, I don't just say, okay, if you're just do this breathing practice because it will make you feel like this. No, no. First, check in. How am I feeling right now? That's awareness, A. And then if you feel that you want to make an adjustment to how you're feeling, then intervene with the breath. There's an intervention. That's the AI of air, right? And the intervention, there's many interventions, and we talk about them at length in the book. How essentially we can dial our nervous system to breathe how we want to feel and breathe how we want to live. And once we've done that intervention, then we observe again, did that work? How does that make me feel? And if it doesn't work, then you can say, Matteo, no thanks. I don't want to do that one. It's awesome. That empowers you because this isn't about like the Matteo program, right? Or whatever pranayama program. It's about you taking charge. So that intervention is about taking charge. And then throughout the day, we can regulate it as needed, right? That's the R. So it's AIR, air. And that regulation, I just want to say this I'm not sort of proposing that we sort of like every moment, second are like checking in, like, how am I feeling? Okay, got to intervene. How am I feeling? Got to intervene. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying where appropriate, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It might be appropriate, and I use many examples in there. Like when you sit down to have a meal, maybe just say, how am I feeling? If you're super stressed at that moment when you're sitting down for dinner, it means that there's no digestive juices and there's less blood in your gut to digest the food. So why don't you do a 5 breath intervention? You could even do it ninja style. You don't have to tell your wife or husband. Just do it just to down regulate until you feel this sort of sweet saliva move in your mouth. And then digestive juices are flowing.
Well,
Or at it, yeah,
you
go
have so
ahead.
many great practices in here, but you know what and you and I, we've been doing a lot of them for a long time. So I could follow along and I could visualize and some of them are practices I do in my, are a part of my life anyway. But something like what you just described, if no one's ever done that before, they don't know what to taste. What is that? What does sweet saliva taste like, right? Like if they don't know this. So how maybe starting with a breathing practice right before a meal, if you're stressed, isn't the right place to begin. So because I really wanted to ask you about your practices and I was going to ask you a little bit later on, but we're sort of just going into it. So, what would be a baby step practice for somebody who's listening and has never thought about the way they breathe or has never done any form of whether it's yogic breathing or Wim Hof or whatever, somatic breathing, and they're worried about hyperventilating? Where's an easy place to begin with this?
It's a good question. Okay. The best place to begin with this is start nasal breathing today. Like keep it nasal. The breath will teach us many things. It will teach us many things. Your breath, your husband's breath is teaching him things that he's just like, whoa, I didn't even you even said it. He said, whoa, I didn't even. So the thing is the breath is teaching your husband that he's a mouth breather, right? So this is this amazing marriage of awareness and the breath, right? So your question is, where do we start with it? So my advice is this: is today, for those of you listening to this podcast, breathe only through your nose. Keep it nasal, unless you're high intensity exercise or speaking or eating. Keep it nasal. That's the first thing. The second thing is you can remember to breathe light and slowly all the time during the day. Try to breathe lightly and slowly, right? And what does that mean? Well, if we're breathing through our nose, it just means that we're just breathing in a very light and slow manner in and out of the nose. I mean, right there, like just a singular breath, you can feel there's a sort of settling that happens. If we don't do that, if we aren't aware of how we're breathing, then Lord knows there's a lot of stressors in the world these days, right? There is
Mhm.
so much stress coming at us, the frequency, the intensity, the amount, um, and also our reaction. We have a lot of stress that's coming from within us.
Yes.
If we don't sort of mitigate, if we don't work with the breath in response to that, then our breath, the way that we're breathing, can be a contributing stressor to our system. If we're breathing through our mouth most of the day, if we're breathing through our mouth, over breathing, or chronic mouth breathing, or if we're breathing through our mouth when we're sleeping, or a number of the other sort of dysfunctional ways that we might be breathing. For example, some of our listeners, you might know that you unconsciously hold your breath, right? When people get in like stressful situations, they oftentimes tense up and hold their breath until they gasp, right? If they do that frequently, if you sort of stair step your breath out and stair step your breath in, there's various ways that are less than optimal, right? I call them dysfunctional ways of breathing. If we're doing that during the day, our breathing, something that we do 20 to 30,000 times a day, is contributing. It's like we have an IV of cortisol pumping into us from our own breathing. So you ask the question, what do we do? 1, keep it nasal. 2, light and slow breathing, right? Just light and slow breathing. And the last thing I'd say with this is somewhere to start is find yourself. And I talk about this in this book, this mnemonic. We'll talk about a practice here. This, I call it mnemonic nose breathing, right? And it's the idea here is that we know we know that we're going to get stressed. I know I'm going to get stressed today. Why? Because I'm a human being. Like stress is going to come, right? And even whether it be stress that I give myself, like through exercise, or whether it's sort of stress that comes where I don't really welcome it, but when I turn on the news or when I look around the world, there's going to be these stressors that are going to come. Because of that, I can think to myself, okay, what am I going to do if I feel stressed? Just because stressors are coming doesn't necessarily mean you're going to feel stressed. But if you start to feel that you're stressed, like if I'm in California, if I pull on I-5, my disposition is that I'm going to be stressed when I'm in all of that traffic. So what am I going to do? I'm going to do mnemonic nose breathing. And what is that? Mnemonic is this word that means a way of remembering. It's a remembering device, if you will. So, and it has 3 steps. The first is you place your tongue on the roof of your mouth, right? So whether it's the tip of your tongue right behind your top teeth, not touching your teeth, just lightly where it touches that, or if it's comfortable to have your tongue actually spread on your upper palate, we just place the tongue on the roof of the mouth. What does this do? This immediately turns on the relaxation response vis-a-vis the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve, which is this wandering nerve, which is the principal nerve of our parasympathetic nervous system, we can turn the switch on by placing the tongue on the roof of the mouth, right? When we do that, we immediately then just turn our attention to our breath, and we just find the breath where we just find if it's on the inhale or the exhale. And the second step, go ahead.
And you can do this anytime. You don't have to close your eyes. You can do it in the car. You can do it waiting to pick up your kids from school. You can do it on a phone call when there's a moment. You can do it when you're on Zoom.
You can do it in the middle of an argument.
Walking a dog. Yeah, anything. So I just wanted to quickly add, like, in case people think, do I need to close my eyes? Do I need to be meditated? Do I need to sit down? You can do it anywhere, anytime, right now.
Todd, it's a good point you bring up. So I love to meditate. I've been meditating for over 30 years. I love to sit hours and hours on end. But what I'm advocating here is like off the cushion. We can do our breathing practices, formal sessions, and I guide those actually in the book, or I have those in the book, in the audio book. I have them guided as well. But here, what we're talking about is sort of like how to meet the moment of stress that comes, right? And so when we hit those moments, and you can even, like right now, the listeners, just think, like right today, how are you going to be stressed? You don't have to like think for very long. It's like they're readily available, whether it's the Lego that you're going to step on in your kids' room, or the traffic, or the other parents in the line waiting to pick up your kids, or like whatever the case may be. There's a gazillion
lifestyle,
or even thoughts of politics, or like whatever the case is. Okay, when it happens, so you don't have to do this. And I would just say this, that if you don't do this, then you are going to be like a casualty to your life, because these stressors are part of your life. Mm-hmm. So rather than trying to push the stressors away, which doesn't work, like it doesn't work, like they are going to come. That's the nature of life right now, that stress is going to happen. So rather than the idea of pushing them away, it's that we recognize that they're there, and that we are going to be in control of the one thing that we can be in control of, our response. Yeah. Right. I can't be in charge of parents, or where my kids throw the Legos, or the other, or all of it around us. It's a very Stoic principle, right? To be concerned with what you can be concerned with. It's a very Buddhist thing as well. Mm-hmm. Like look at your response, right? Yeah. And so stress happens. So what do we do? First step, put your tongue on the roof of your mouth, and immediately within seconds, find your breath. And you just find wherever your breath is. And then as you inhale, and then on your exhalation, extend your exhalation. Now, people might be like, oh, for how long and whatnot. If you want to count, breathe in for 4 and out for 6. Okay, I'll give you the number: in for 4, out for 6. But it doesn't really matter. For you, just breathe out longer than you breathe in, right? And this, again, we're going to be breathing through our nose. And so there's, because of that smaller nasal passageway, there's some ability for you to control your breath easier when you breathe through your nose than through your mouth. So I pull on to the interstate or whatever stressor happens. And let me just say this: sometimes you don't need to do this, or sometimes you don't want to do this because you need to act much quicker. The stressor of your kid running into the busy street, or the stressor of your dog getting off leash. No, don't put your tongue in the roof of your mouth. Run, like do what you need to do, right? That's
Yes.
the appropriate action. So we're talking here about like the appropriateness and the timing,
Hmm.
sort of skillfully deploying these breathing. So here
It's
again,
more like a trigger in the, a trigger that's something that annoys you constantly, and you're just, oh my gosh, this person, and that's a great moment to go
yeah,
breathe, implement, and then you've paused, see how you approach that scenario in a
yeah.
different way.
And the third point on this, the third part of the mnemonic nose breathing: tongue in the roof of the mouth. Find your breath and extend the exhale, and apply a mantra, or apply a positive affirmation, or a word, or a prayer, whatever the case is. So then, after you found your breath and you extend your exhale, say it just silently in the mind, one time on the inhale and one time on the exhale. And this requires you to decide ahead of time what that word is going to be. And you might even practice this a few times because, like all of these breathing techniques, they're tools. And a carpenter, when he goes to build a house, doesn't like pick up a tool for the first time and be like, okay, I'm going to just go do this. No, no, they need to get skilled with it. And that is the case, like 100% with all of these breathing techniques, is you need to try them on. You need to have some mental and physical agility with them. So then you can apply them when it really counts. And so this mnemonic nose breathing, tongue in the roof of the mouth, extend your exhale, and apply the mantra on the inhale and the exhale. And I do this myself all the time, and it's one of the main things I tell when people ask me, like, well, what can I do? Because it employs a number of different things that are happening physiologically and mentally. And I've never had anybody that came back and said, well, that doesn't work, Matteo. I've had other techniques. I've had other techniques where people like, that doesn't work for me. This doesn't. Yeah.
No, it's very elevating as a practice because it does several things. It, as you said, it slows everything down. It calms your nervous system in a matter of seconds. We're not even thinking about how it's affecting us physiologically. It just does. And then you can just proceed in a different way. And over time, the more and more you employ this,
Absolutely.
it really affects you. And like you just said, you become so skilled at it that it's like almost second nature, that it's like it's like you're being taught a skill, a life skill that allows you to deal with situations, no matter what comes up, whether you're being triggered or whatever, or the stress. And it's just it's amazing. So now if somebody is already a skilled practitioner and has been exposed to
Yeah.
other practices, what do you think? You've got you don't actually have breath of fire in here. You've got alternate nostril breathing, you have the box breath, and you've got a triangle breath. You've got a bunch of other breaths. Just on the practices, what do you think of breath of fire? While it's not in your book, I'll use it if I'm picking up my daughter and it's a warm day and I'm tired and I've gotten hot from being in the car, sitting in my car for 15 minutes waiting for her or whatever. I'll use breath of fire to awaken, to stimulate my nervous system, as opposed to go buy another coffee and it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon,
Yeah.
which is not a good idea. So what do you think of employing something like this? And the other breath I wanted to ask you, holotropic breathing. What do you think about this technique?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I love this question. So, and it's a kind of a question for, like, as you said, for sort of people, for yogis, for people who are already doing these practices, like, why, like, what use would this book be? for that. And this is
Oh,
my
this is
approach to
still a
it. So
great book. I mean, I got so much out of
yeah,
it. Like, it's still a book
right.
for yogis, regardless of your expertise with pranayama
Exactly.
or
And
not.
the
Really.
reason is that my approach to, so I'm still, my main practice is still pranayama. And I try to understand physiologically what is happening when we do the whole gamut of pranayama practices, right? So I actually charted out for myself. I was wearing sort of like various devices and whatnot, and I observed what was happening when I would do my various practices, what was happening to my oxygen levels
Oh,
and
you're such a
my
breath nerd. I love it.
and my CO2 levels,
That's
right?
amazing.
And I was seeing if I was becoming hypercapnic or hypoxic while I was doing my various practices, right?
Amazing.
And I was matching that with how I actually thought I was feeling,
Wow.
right? So, so, so you asked the question, like, what do I think about breath of fire, or maybe Bastrika, or these practices where the emphasis is there's a strong emphasis on the exhale.
Mhm.
And we don't have to get into deeply right now, although I kind of do in the book, um, to talking about the importance of CO2 in our system and what happens when we overbreathe. Essentially, that overbreathing disrupts the blood gases. So I've practiced on myself and observed other yogis on what happens to their blood gases when they're doing pranayama practices, the various ones, right? And so having that knowledge, then the question is, what do I think about breath of fire or Bastrika, or maybe let's just use those two where there's this sort of emphasis. My response is, if that's what you want from your system and you know what it's going to do to your system, then that is like an amazing tool that you have at your disposal, right? Know that it is going to be very upregulating. So it's probably not the best practice to do before you go to bed. I mean, and no yoga teacher in India probably recommends Kapalabhati before bed, but there might be some individuals who are doing their sort of Kundalini yoga, right? There's sort of Kundalini breathing, which a lot of times it mirrors a kind of breath of fire practice
Mhm.
at various times.
Well,
And
you might,
then they
because if
wonder
you're
what,
in the Himalayas and you're going to be doing a 6-hour nighttime fire ceremony, then you need to be awake.
there you go. There you go. And that's the whole point with this, is that when we know the effects of the practice, then it's very, very empowering, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, so and I will do, so whenever I do, even my own pranayama teacher, two of them in India, sort of primary pranayama teachers, whenever we would do Bastrika or Kapalabhati, these practices together, these sort of more energetic practices, I always like to do the external hold, right?
Mm.
The exhale and hold my breath. And I think that I just did that because I would get too amped up.
Okay.
And I wanted to sort of down regulate rather than if I held my breath on the internal and did all of the locks, did all of the locks. I mean, maybe that they wanted me to sort of like explode in this way, but I would just feel too much energy. It was sort of too overwhelming. So I even at that time, I intuitively knew that I wanted to sort of like balance out the upregulating practice and the energy giving, the sort of pranic, the pranic moving upward practice of these with this sort of downward apana
Yeah.
practice that would
Yeah.
happen with the external breath hold.
Mhm.
So, and and I just love this that we have this at our disposal, that you, before you go pick up your kids, can do a bit of like breath of fire in the car and you know what it's going to do. And so, I mean, I would just like, I love that you're asking the questions in this way, because it loops my whole approach to this interoceptive awareness, to the intervention, to the regulation and back, right?
Well,
Yeah.
thank you.
So Todd, you asked about that. And then the second question about holotropic breathing.
Yeah, because that's becoming quite, dare I say, trendy, but there's definitely a movement of interest with this type of breathing technique.
Yeah. So, and I'm just going to loop in Wim Hof breathing at the same time, okay?
Yeah.
Because what we're doing with now, I'm not a, I say I haven't studied I had my period of time with Wim Hof breathing. I haven't studied holotropic breathing, but I know what the technique is. I've done it. I've done it sometimes
Mhm.
and totally enjoyed it.
Yeah, same
It
here.
was a
But
it
you and
was a
I have
trip.
a advanced practice where we can drop into that way of breathing in a different way, I think, than someone who's never been exposed to breath work of any kind.
Yeah, and let me just describe a little bit for those who haven't, and for those who have, maybe if my description isn't sort of in line with what you've experienced and whatnot, then we'd love to hear what your experience was. But so what we're doing when during holotropic breathing or Wim Hof breathing is that you're over breathing, right? Your Wim Hof called it super ventilating. You got the holotropic breath. What you're doing is you're hyperventilating, right? Meaning that you're breathing more than your metabolic capacity, than your metabolic demand needs. And when you do that, there's various things that happen within your body. Principally, that begins happening within your blood. And what's happening within your blood, I'll just give a little, I find it super interesting. And if you've listened to the podcast this far, you probably are into this sort of breatharian type of everything, all things breath. When we breathe, we breathe in oxygen, right? There's about 21% oxygen in the air. We breathe it in, it goes into our lungs, goes out of our lungs and into our bloodstream. Those oxygen molecules, they attach to something called hemoglobin. And the hemoglobin is like the vehicle that takes it around our system and it delivers it to our brain, to our organs, and to our cells. And the reason that the oxygen molecules jump off the hemoglobin, it's regulated by how much carbon dioxide we have in our blood, right?
Mhm.
When we overbreathe, when we hyperventilate, when we do Wim Hof breathing, like that, or if you're doing this holotropic breathing or two-part, it might be something like, when we start doing those type of, even just those, I feel it in my head. When we start breathing in that manner, we drop the level of CO2, of carbon dioxide in our bloodstream. And that means that there's less oxygen being delivered to our brain and to our organs. And that is why when we hyperventilate, we feel lightheaded. Well, I'm not a medical doctor. Then I should, I'm not dispensing anything medical.
Talk to your own experience with doing that breath. How did it make
Okay.
you feel?
Okay. So so it's so interesting. So let me talk about Wim Hof and then holotropic. Wim Hof, 30 or 40 breaths where you hyperventilate, you've blown off all of the CO2, right? So you inhale, then you exhale and hold. And immediately you're holding your breath. And because you've blown off all of this CO2, that's the reason that you're able to hold your breath for 2 minutes, 3 minutes. I was holding my breath for over 4 minutes doing Wim Hof breathing. And it's an amazing trip. It is like a trip,
It
right?
alters your
You're
state of
holding
consciousness. Like, let's be honest. Like, that's what happens
super,
to me. Especially with,
super altered states of consciousness,
yeah,
right? So there's that Wim Hof, super altered states of consciousness with the Wim Hof, and the holotropic, it's even more so.
yes.
Why? Because you do this for an hour to 3 hours. It's mind blowing. Now,
And it's
holotropic
not
breathing
to be
should, and I
done
say,
alone. This is not a breath practice. You need to definitely have an experienced practitioner to support
never should be
you
doing this alone.
100%. This is a
Yeah,
not
and none of these should ever be
non-negotiable
done near
individual
water.
practice.
And none of this should be done near the water as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Ever. So you move into these altered states of consciousness. Now, holotropic breathing was developed by this guy named Stanislav Grof, super fascinating individual. He was one of the early researchers into altered states of consciousness and psychedelics. When the U.S. government banned the research, he wanted to find some other way to move into altered states of consciousness, and he developed this breathing technique called holotropic breathing. And according to them, they are able to do sort of traumatic work that you, with the therapist and whatnot, that this sort of stirs up, and you're able to have this neurogenesis, or sort of because you're in this very vulnerable place, that you meet these traumatic episodes and that you work through it. So it's sort of like trauma release or trauma therapy. Holotropic breath work is oftentimes used for that. So I personally have not done the 3-hour holotropic breathing sessions. I've done the hour-long ones, and it is truly like you move into altered states of consciousness, perhaps out of body. It is extraordinary what the breath can do. Personally speaking, like that is how to say, those are useful for in terms of like episodes to work with those for particular reasons. But for day-to-day breathing, we don't want to be doing that. And actually, Wim Hof breathing or holotropic breathing, the way that you breathe is detrimental to your health long term. That if one was to do this, and this is why Wim Hof breathing, people that do this every day, I mean, there's a particular kind of individual and disposition that if they're doing Wim Hof every day, that you can identify from a mile away. They are amped, and maybe they want that, and maybe they need that for this particular, and that's awesome, and go for it. But for the most part, most of the people I meet, it's actually about down regulation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting practice, both of them. With holotropic breathing, for me, I used it almost in a shamanic journey-like capacity without, utilizing plant medicine or anything like that. It was all, as you know, the breath, it's all breath, and you work into that state of an altered state. And I then took my own spiritual practice during that hour or during the build up towards the altering of consciousness, to connect to my spirit guides and really utilize that opportunity to expand my connection and sort of seek answers or communicate about a very specific thing, and then afterwards come back using the breath, come back into the body to settle. And so it was a profound experience. They've been profound experiences, but they're very specific, and it's literally like once or twice a year, and it's not even, that, if that, you know what I mean? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I mean, the breath, and I think that it's interesting what you just said there is that you're using the breath and other sort of ways that you sort of partner with the breath when you move into these altered states of consciousness, or even with plant medicine, or even things like if you're sick, because sickness is a kind, it can put us in a kind of altered state. We can use the breath to help us during those rides, during those trips, right?
yeah.
And we can
Because
also
it
use the breath
definitely, it is like that. It is like a trip. You have a build, it builds up, and then you're in a state, and then you come down. But
yeah,
you've got to be guided to come back down. So you're reintegrating into your body, and with a really experienced practitioner who knows how to guide everybody back into
yeah,
themselves, and use the
yeah.
breath to then ground and come back down. So this is why this is not a practice that you do on your own, watching a YouTube video or whatever, it's
Oh
like,
no.
don't do it
Oh
alone.
oh no. Yeah,
Really.
I've seen people.
Seriously.
Yeah, yeah, it's fair warning. Yeah, not to do even Wim Hof breathing. I would recommend, like, I would caution, just to jump on YouTube and do something that somebody's instructing there. That I would recommend that you be with somebody if you want to do that. That you be with somebody there, because the danger with these things is that you pass out,
Yes.
and that you pass out in some sort of state that isn't safe. Whether that be then you hit your head, or you do that where you're definitely, like I said, don't do this near water.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
and there's that physical side, and then you and I both know people who have journeyed with the breath into these spaces and didn't quite negotiate it very well, and have come back. It's a little bit like these things, like when you get in a shower, and you're sort of like, if you've got all kinds of dirt on you, and you like lather up, and then you get out of the shower, but you don't finish. It's a little bit like you're dirtier than you were when you got in. That can happen if there isn't the integration, if you don't
Yes.
sort of land very well and there isn't the integration, that things can be sort of like stirred up, and they haven't been sort of worked through appropriately. So, yeah.
Yeah. And that's not a comfortable place for those people emotionally.
Mm-mm.
They can't explain, they don't have the language to understand, well, because they haven't learned it yet, what's happening to them emotionally and what are they feeling. And it could be something buried so deep inside of you in your subconscious that was awakened and brought up that you have to face, that now
Mm-hmm.
you don't know how to face it. So, and then also given the time after that, like, don't go the next day and go, oh my God, that was amazing, oh, I'm gonna do it again. It's like, you need the time to let your physical body catch up to where the breath took you. right?
Yeah.
Unlike your book, it has a lot of practices you can do on your own very safely and beautifully and calmly, and they're designed to do the complete opposite. But also, I think that's what people need to learn, how to come into that space, breathe, the way our bodies were designed to breathe, so we can really experience this. But and so let's talk about, with all this breath, because this last section of the book is so important to explain, and that's
Mm,
how you want to die. It's just amazing, especially with the 9 contemplations on death. Like they're really powerful.
yeah. Yeah. Well, so, the book, like, in that first part where I do the 5 tools, I sort of essentially think that these are the tools that we want to breathe how we want to feel. And then we apply those in the second part to day-to-day breathing, to sleep, to exercise, to meditation and flow states and prayer, and everything in between. You apply it. And that's sort of breathe how you want to live.
Yeah.
And then this third part I entitled Breathe How You Want to Die. And it may seem not exactly out of place, but in contrast to what we just did about sort of living life fully and optimally with the breath, and all of a sudden we take this turn in part 3 about death and dying. And as you mentioned at the very top of the podcast, at the beginning of the book, I talk a little bit about where I had a tree fall on me when I was 8 years old,
Mhm.
and I went out. We were out cutting firewood down, and a wind blew a tree down. And I what ended up happening during that time was I like exited my body, and I narrate what happens, but essentially, when the tree was lifted off of me, the the air that rushed into me, the breath that returned to me, breath and life came back at the same time. So that experience sort of stuck with me, and it returned about 20 years, a little bit less than 20 years later, when I went to live in Nepal, in Kathmandu. For the first time, I was sort of fresh out of college. I went there and I lived next to this temple called Pashupatinath.
Mhm.
And Pashupatinath, it's along the Bagmati River, which is a sacred river to the Ganges. And it's where they bring the people, they bring them down to cremate them. And I lived just around the corner from there.
Beautiful.
I
That's
lived
where
with
they
a
bring the
family.
bodies.
Yeah, they bring the bodies, the
That's where
corpses,
they bring
right?
the bodies. I've seen it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so I was there just as like a 20-year-old American kid, like every day I would see 6, 8, 10 corpses just being brought down to
Yeah.
be burned. And I was, in America, we don't see death very much unless you're like involved with hospital work, or maybe in the military, or like you just don't see death. Even our parents and our grandparents, they're sort of whisked away, or we don't sort of see it so much. So it left a very strong impression on me. And at the time, I was studying with a Buddhist nun. As soon as I arrived there, I started studying with this Buddhist nun, and she had told me she taught me how to meditate on the breath, basic breath awareness, following the inhale in, following the inhale out, and noticing when you're distracted. Anapanasati, like the basic Buddhist instruction on mindfulness of the breath. And at the same time, she said, go down to the riverside and just sit there and observe and watch these bodies being burnt. And so for months and months, this is what I did. I would meditate on the breath, and I would go down there. And I one of the things that I sort of one of the realizations was that when I saw these people being burned, that when they breathed out their last breath, I don't know if any of them knew it. Like if anybody, and even like today, right now, there's no guarantee. Like right now, when you're listening to this podcast, when you breathe out, there's no guarantee that you're going to breathe in. For me right now, there's no guarantee. I mean, we think but it's a big assumption, and at some point, that's what's going to happen is we're going to breathe out and we're not going to breathe back in. And then that is when we're going to die. That is when the sort of death process will have already started. And this thought of this it could it could sort of almost sort of paralyzing to people, like a bit of fear. Or for me, what it did was to like be like, I don't know how long this is going to happen, so I may as well jump in with both feet fully on for everything that's happening, because everything that we do each day, every single thing, it might be the last time we do it. Like the cappuccino I was drinking here at the beginning of the podcast, it might be the last cappuccino I ever have. There's a possibility of that. And so why not completely appreciate that cappuccino? This conversation might be the last conversation I have. So why not be so present with Tatiana right now? Because there's no guarantee. And so this thing that was imprinted on me when I was like 23, 24, and that I've carried through with my meditation practice and with my breathing practices. And it's where I start. This is where I start my sharing in part 3 of the book.
Yeah, I really love that story about being in Nepal there. There's something actually it's very powerful when you witness the bodies being burned. There's a beauty to it. It's not gross. It's not, it's not a bad thing to witness. It's actually a really beautiful thing to witness. But what I loved in this chapter is the 9 contemplations on death.
Mm-hmm.
You have them listed. I mean, they're really meditations on death with thinking, and you don't have to think about all 9 in one go. You can take one and think about what that means. It does serve us to really think about these. So what are the 9 contemplations? How can we use
Yeah,
this as a breathing technique? Why does it matter?
yeah. Well, so I mean, why it matters, I'll just start out with why it matters is that, in life, there's only one thing that's guaranteed, and that's that it's going to end. That's the only thing that's guaranteed about this. Like everything else is sort of dependent upon circumstances, but that this one thing that we're going to die is certain, and there's only one thing certain about that, is that we don't know when. That's the kicker, right? That's why, and this that we don't know when is the reason that there's this sort of existential angst that we have, that there is a sort of like anxiety can arise. And so, and I talk about, and I just want to say at the beginning of this chapter, or the beginning of this section of the book, is the part 3 of the book. I recommend that if there are these feelings of anxiousness, or if there's a sort of like hesitancy to think about it, then I recommend going in very, very lightly. Use the breathing techniques that we discussed in part 1 and part 2 to help down regulate the system. Perhaps even read them almost like you just reading a book, rather than contemplating them, where they might have a little bit more of an impact. So I recommend using the breath as you navigate through this. But the 9 contemplations is this practice that this nun taught me early on, and it was taught to me by a Buddhist nun, but they're not Buddhist. Like they're not they're just about humanity, right? About the human life, and they are like, they're kind of truth
Yeah.
just to think about. And what ends up happening, that the power of contemplation, and this is something that I learned in my many, many decades of studying Buddhism, the power of contemplation comes from the effect it has on your system, not from a sort of like thing that you get, a thing that you know from the contemplation, right? So, for example, the first of the contemplation is that our life is always decreasing. Like the amount of our life is always decreasing. Now, you might be like, or the listener might be like, yeah, of course it always is. But when we sit and we think about it, there's a certain something arises out of that. And what arises out of that, maybe you want to spend more time with your dog, right? It may be that you want to spend more time with your family. It may be that you immediately get up and write a note about how much you love a family member. Or might be, I'm going to jump into my political action because I need to do this now because everything is decreasing, right? So the effect of it, we can't always know, right? But there is this definite sort of like consequence of contemplations. Like the first one is like life is always decreasing. That and again, some of these might seem they might seem kind of obvious, but I just recommend giving it a go just to sort of think about it. And I guided in the book, you can do all 9 in one session, or you just do one. You can just think of one for maybe a week or a month or even longer. And it's just something to sort of have in the back of your mind. You can do it in a formal contemplation or something that you sort of just return to almost like it's written down. The second one is that death comes whether we're prepared or not. Right.
Mhm.
Right. Just like it's that's a fact. Right. Yeah. And so, and the one that follows right on there is that the time of death is uncertain. Right. Even for those individuals who are sort of in the process of dying, like um if somebody's in hospice, even then you don't actually know the time.
Yeah.
Right. So, or like us right here, we think of ourselves as very healthy, but there's no guarantee that something couldn't happen next hour. So the time is uncertain, right? Then you move into like this next, they're sort of in triplets, right? The next three is like death has many causes, right? It like it has so many ways there's so many ways that you could die, right? And again, this doesn't have to be like depressing. It just is more of a factual matter. And that if that's the case, and that the one right after there is that this human body is very fragile, right? And that even though it's very fragile, no possessions or medicines or wealth or anything can do anything for this body when death comes, right? It doesn't, and so that doesn't mean like that we just get rid of all of our possessions and we just don't worry about it. Quite the contrary. Is that if we can utilize those things to further our understanding and our realization of the truth of death and dying, and how that while we're still alive, we can act with empathy and with compassion and with skillful means in the world, then it gives us more urgency and more clarity in doing so. Right.
Yeah.
And the last three are a little bit about like, again, like that even our loved ones can't help us, our body can't help us. And so there's these 9 contemplations, and it's getting back to this point of that it's going to happen and we don't know when. The 9 contemplations are sort of like they are essentially sort of commentary on this on this. And like I said, it doesn't have to be like hours and hours. It can just be when you wake up in the morning, is that everything's impermanent, so am I. So I'm going to make positive change today.
And
Right?
how
Because
does the breath relate to those practices then? Because this
yeah,
is a book about breathing.
yeah. So the way that the breath relates to this is that the breath is is sort of woven in all of those contemplations, in the sense that when the breath ceases, that's when that happens. That is when death happens, right? And so how can we be prepared? How can we be prepared for that? Well, during life, right now, when we're healthy, that we can actually practice dying every time we exhale. When we exhale, there's a slight pause at the end. And when we can rest in the awareness of that pause, it's a very spacious, aware place. And then we breathe back in. And that happens, as we've talked, that happens 25,000 times a day. In that, at the end of our exhale, if we can let go completely and then inhale back life, right? There's this dance that happens of letting go and feeling full, letting go and being alive, letting go. It comes back and forth in this way. So this awareness of the breath, so with the contemplations, I use the breath to put us into a sort of a sort of relaxed and aware mode so that we can contemplate, because we can't really contemplate if we're in this elevated state, if we're in a stressed out state.
Yeah.
So, but then the breath itself becomes much more, it becomes and I interweave a couple practices with this. One of them is called this letting go awe practice. Because when we're dying, if we have loved ones around us, or if we have the wherewithal to tell ourselves to understand that this is happening, the breath is the thing, it is the aspect of our physicality that is going to be giving us indicators as we die, right? So the way that the breath is, and we discuss this in the next section of the book, that when we die, there's a sort of a death rehearsal is the next part. And this has been, since I started that, this has been like one of my main practices, is this rehearsing my death. And they're like, what? Like rehearsing your death? You actually practice dying. And why would we ever want to do that? Right? For
Yeah,
me,
it sounds morbid, doesn't it? It's like,
yeah,
what?
it could sound morbid, right? But
Mhm.
the idea, like, so first of all,
Well, also the brain is so powerful, does it know any different? Does it know that when you're telling yourself you're dying, that you're actually not?
well, I mean, just in my own experience, this practice of this is the idea of being lucidly aware at this distinctly unique moment of when we die. And I take us up in the book, I take us up to that portal.
Yeah.
When the portal opens, and I had a little bit of experience when I was 8 years old,
Mhm.
because the lights came and all of that, it sort of came, but it still feels like I was still knocking at the door. I don't go beyond there in this book. What happens beyond death is all almost all of my teachers talk about what happens after death, and
That's a whole other book. That's like
it's a whole other book, and
photo
I'm not going
and
to write
where we
that.
are, our states of consciousness,
No,
are we in limp, yeah,
yeah,
that's a whole other conversation.
yeah. But I just take us up to this to be as lucidly aware as we can at that time. And it's very, very powerful. What it is that it's a visualization. It's just sort of using the imagination, where you go through the physical dissolution of the body, and meaning the physical dissolution where the fire goes out of the body, the water goes out of the body, the sort of air goes out. There's this sort of progressive dissolution of the elements
Yeah.
with our senses, with our
Yeah.
visual sense, with our taste, with our hearing, with the way that we're feeling our skin. So there's the physical dying, and then the internal dissolution of perception, of awareness, and eventually where consciousness dissolves and then exits.
Yeah.
And all along the way, there's signposts along the way that this death process is happening. And if we can familiarize ourselves with they're sort of internal visions, they're not exactly the way that they're kind of they're a feeling state, but they're also sort of like what we see that is happening, not with our eyes, but
Yeah.
within our mind's eye. That if we can habituate ourselves, or not habituate, but just get to know that, so then when it actually is taking place, we aren't so freaked out by it. Because if we aren't, these things can be definitely fear inducing, and we don't want to be fearful when we're dying.
Yes. Yeah, what's interesting about this practice, which I've actually done before, and I know some people don't like to say the word death or dying, they just, it freaks them out. So I found it to be this really beautiful practice of, and you said the elements yourself, it's more of a releasing of the elements that are contained within us, because we're all made up of the elements. And when you can allow yourself to visualize what it looks like to that the blood is watery, and we're earth, like we're made of earth, and how we can return to the soil, and that we're all one. It's actually more of a consciousness practice versus a dying, like the physical body maybe what is no longer, but you're actually merging with a oneness. So it's more of a consciousness extended or expanded consciousness practice. I found.
It is absolutely that. And that's why in the previous chapter to this, I work with space as the object of our meditation. Right. So we recognize the space within the body, like, for example, the space within inside your head right now,
Mhm.
like your brain and the various organs are just occupying that. But if you were to remove that, the space wouldn't move. The
Yes.
space is still there. So we feel that space within the body, then we extend out, and we eventually expand our awareness out to as large as space is, which is sort of a bit mind bending to do that, and then pour our awareness into space like water being poured into water.
And Joe Dispenza does that, guides people so brilliantly into the space, right? He really takes people
Exactly.
into this space. So if anyone's familiar with his
Yeah.
work, he totally takes you.
Yeah.
He's just not naming it using Buddhist terminology or tantric terminology.
Yeah.
He's not using
Exactly, and it's
very
interesting.
language
And
at
it's
all.
interesting you say that, because so the way that I present the death rehearsal is it's a little bit the way that I learned it was within the Buddhist context. But of course, in the tantric, there's the Laya yoga, which is there's a very similar. It's very similar
Yeah.
in the dissolution.
Yes.
So some of our listeners might be familiar with that. I took a little bit of maybe the religious terminology, and I don't use any jargon in it. And both of these practices, the 9 contemplations and the death rehearsal, is being used by many hospice workers and
Yeah,
palliative care
death
workers
doulas.
and death doulas in the United States now.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, I think it's great. Well, this has been an awesome conversation with you. We've talked about so many things. I literally wrote so many questions. I think we covered almost all of them. It was awesome. So thank you. So good. I love
yeah, good,
this.
good,
Totally.
good. Thank you for this.
Well, so where can we find your book and all of your wonderful material?
Yeah, so I'll say this. So the book has all of the guided practices in it. The audiobook that I read the audiobook myself. All of the guided practices in that has music and soundscape behind it. Some of the down regulating practices have binaural beats behind them. And so that's, if you're into that, if you're into sort of learning and consuming books in that way, just check out the audiobook. Um, you can find me at my website, matteopistono.com, or on Instagram. And I also send out monthly guided breathing practices, breathing and meditation. So if you want to sign up for that, you can go to matteopistono.com and sign up for that. I'm happy to send that to you. And thanks for checking out. Breathe How You Want to Feel.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. Such a great book. I love it.
Great.
It's a life manual. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you.